You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome everybody. This is meditation. Well, this is I Love You Keep Going. It's my my weekly talk. It's September 22nd, 2022. It's 7:36 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, and I was thinking about talking about view today. What I think about and was going to frame it as attachment view, but it grows out of the experience of Buddhist traditional ways of framing it. Right view is, of course, to see the value or the truth of the Four Noble Truths. That's what we would consider that. So it's what I think is so interesting about American culture or culture in the West is that we tend to think of the Four Noble Truths as an expression of nihilism or this kind of passive nihilism. It's often how it's understood because of the way that our conditioning is. Depending on how you frame that, nihilism was a response to Enlightenment, which was the 16th, 1700s, and the understanding of the nature of God in the Christian context in society, and then the divine meaning, and then nihilism in the passive form was that there is, of course, no meaning. Nothing is meaningful. Nothing is intrinsically meaningful. Nothing is intrinsically valuable. It's all something that we make up for ourselves. And then the active form of that is where you really try to deconstruct things. So you'll hear that I think sometimes in Buddhist circles, the deconstructing experience and coming up to an essentially that there's nothing intrinsic, nothing meaningful about it. I don't think that that's actually what's intended by that. I really think that full engagement is what's intended by the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, that it's the clinging to and wanting what is happening to be different than it is, and not understanding our influence in the way that we create experience, conditioned experience, which is the piece about view. Nihilism, of course, has given way to modernism and postmodernism in our culture, and postmodernism differs from nihilism in that nihilism is that there is no meaning, there is no intrinsic meaning, there's no intrinsic value, and postmodernism is really that it's relative, and we can't discern what's meaningful and what isn't meaningful because everything is understood in the context of our own conditioning, which might be closer, but it still does tend to create a sense of relativism about things, and I would also take umbrage with that. But when we begin to explore view, we really do get to see the nature of our conditioning, which is relevant to us. We do make up the experiences that we're having in the way that human bodies make up the experience, and we know things the way that the human body can know things. And some of those things are meaningful, even if they're only meaningful to us, that's still of value. It's not valueless. I know that sitting with Shinzen for a long time, he was constantly interested in finding the theory of everything in meditation, the one form of meditation that everyone would do that would bring everyone to the experience of liberation. And that somehow that was more valuable than the individual strategies that people were using that led them to liberation. And so I tended to find that the individual strategies that work are valuable. One of the things that comes forward in this is the attachment conditioning, and that the way to repair attachment conditioning is not the same for all attachment conditions. And you wouldn't be looking for a particular way of changing those views because the thing that causes those views is so different. When you look at a secure person, they think of themselves as capable, and they think of the world as a place that will meet their needs, that all they have to do is ask for that and the world will respond to that. So they conduct themselves as if that were true, and in the way that they conduct themselves, often they find that that is true, in the sense that we create the experience that we have, and in the creation of that experience we create conduct, where we create the intention and action that we take.
George, you just said that secure people tend to think of themselves as capable, and for them, the world is a place that will meet their needs.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit and contrast it with the other attachment styles, just for us to have more context about that?
So we don't see ourselves directly. We see ourselves as a reflection. So first, really, we see ourselves as a reflection of mind, but also we see ourselves as a reflection of other people. That is to say, other people experience us and reflect back to us what they're experiencing. And so when we're infants and we're completely dependent on somebody taking care of us, we make an expression. We don't even know what we need, really. We don't know any of that. We just make the expression that something needs to be different, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to ask a newborn or a 4-day-old what it is that they're actually thinking that created the gesture that they expressed. But then if you have a sensitive enough caregiver who's responsive, they connect. They use their capacity to empathize. They use their capacity to understand the nature of the request. They reflect back to the infant what that expression means in terms of their interpretation of it, and that they take an action to solve the dilemma of the infant. And the infant begins to track this. They begin to understand that if I express myself in this way, the person who comes to take care of me is going to respond in a certain way, and then they're going to do something for me. And so we begin to learn this vocabulary of how to express ourselves, but we're not making a universal expression. We're making an expression that's aimed at the caregiver who comes, and their reflection back to us of what our expression means to them is what we begin to understand is who we are and what we need and how we can go about getting it. Is that all making sense? You express yourself spontaneously. If you have a sensitive enough caregiver, they're paying attention, so they see the expression, and then they interpret the expression based on their conditioning, and then they respond back. They mirror back the expression of that, and then they take care of you. If you are secure, you don't worry about that. You make the expression, and your expectation is that the response will be useful to you. That's the nature of the view of security. But if that doesn't happen, then you develop other views about this, other expectations of what the world will do and what it won't do for you. This is all not knowing necessarily whether your expression is within reason or not. There isn't that aspect of it. Just that you're making the expression and the world is responding in a particular way. And you're associating to the response of the world the initial impulse to express it. All of this is without language, right? So let's say that you grow up to be a dismissing adult. What you notice in the childhood of a dismissing adult is that there isn't a sensitive caregiver there to receive the messages. There isn't a meaningful response that's associated with the particular message that you send. There's not much of a response. There's a sort of a practical care that comes where the sustenance needs are met, but the nurturance needs are not recognized. And so you don't look for the world to respond to those needs. You know, there's an economy to this. You look to the world to respond to expressions that actually create a response, right? You make a gesture that you have a sense will create some kind of response, and the gestures that don't create any response, you abandon. Is that making sense? So what you notice in childhoods of people who grow up to be dismissing is a misattunement of the caregiver in the early part of life that's consistent. And so that the child learns not an authentic expression of themselves, but an expression of themselves that will get a response from the caregiver. So it's very focused on the presentation of a version that is acceptable, and everything that isn't that is not expressed openly. And so that when you get to be older, there is the world that's secret to you, that isn't expressible. And then there's the way that you need to express yourself in order to get a response from somebody else. And this is the way you are, right? All of that part of you that was rejected in childhood, all of that part of you that was suppressed is yours and not shareable. And then you get good at presenting to other people what it is you think that they need you to express in order to get from them what you want. Is that making sense? Jay?
And what you just expressed is the worldview of the what do you call it? The second one.
So that's the view of a dismissing person.
Yeah, the view of the dismissing person. That sounds so painful. That sounds just so incredibly painful to consider.
Yes, terribly painful, but also unexpressible. One of the reasons it's so painful is that the person who carries that feels that it's unexpressible, so they don't express it.
How do you begin to break through the barrier where that person starts to feel that they can, one, they can understand themselves, and two, they can express themselves and that they can get their needs met? It feels so overwhelming. Like, how do you help a person get to that place?
Well, one of the things about dismissing people is that they explore well. And so they understand the advantages of exploration, and they understand finding value in things. So you don't have to convince them of that. What you have to convince them of is that even though their early experience was one of constant rejection of the things that were meaningful to them, not everyone will do that. Now, because they're good explorers, you can present this as a conundrum for them, that there are people who actually will respond to those unexpressible things in a way that would actually be satisfying to you in the expression of them. And that what you can do to find that out is make that expression and see what happens. And usually there's enough curiosity in a dismissing person that they're willing to try it. Now, you have to set it up for them in a way that they're careful about who they make that expression to, so that they don't reinforce the experience of rejection. Mostly, the experience for dismissing people of rejection is a fearfulness of being abandoned. When you said how painful you it must have been for them. If you set up kids secure, dismissing, preoccupied, and disorganized, or secure, anxious, avoidant, anxious, ambivalent, and disorganized, the anxious, avoidant, the kids are the ones in the most pain because they never ask anyone to help them with it. And so the terrible sadness for them is what they need to be able to hold in order to try that. But because they are good explorers, if you ask them to see if they can hold the terrible sadness, most of the time, pretty quickly, they have the experience that they can, and then it's not an impediment for them anymore. Because really, the thing that keeps that area protected is the fearfulness around having to be plunged into the terrible sadness. Is that helpful?
So they are pretty,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Please. So they are pretty close to secure in a sense, but they just have this one big hurdle of holding on to this sadness about the fear of being rejected and their needs not being met.
Well, it depends. There's a spectrum of dismissing. Somebody who is a D1, let's say, their emotional system is completely shut off, and they're closed off to it. And also they don't value relationships. And so you have to repair the capacity to experience emotions. And then you have to get them to change their mind about valuing relationships, which means they need to learn to collaborate. So when you look at the 3 dimensions of secure functioning, you have the attachment system. Their attachment system is suppressed and left off. Their exploration system, which is left on, and the collaboration system. They don't have a collaborative system, so they have to learn to collaborate. That's challenging for them. And they don't have an attachment system activated, so they have to activate that. So it actually can be quite a bit that they need to do, but it's easier to fix, and they already know how to explore, so that they can investigate and find direct experiences of things that support actually activating the attachment system, and actually because they can explore, they can learn the collaborative system faster than somebody like a preoccupied person who doesn't know how to explore. The problem with not knowing how to explore is you have to learn to explore before you can then learn the things that you need to know in order to change the underlying view. So whereas the secure kid has good enough responses to the gestures they make, and a dismissing adult or an anxious avoidant kid has consistent failure in that area. A preoccupied adult had a childhood, an anxious ambivalent childhood, where the response of the caregiver was unpredictable. But unpredictable enough that they didn't ever settle into the idea that they could make a gesture that would elicit a specific response. Is that making sense? So both the secure person and the dismissing person understands consistency, different ends of that. But a preoccupied adult doesn't understand consistency, and they don't understand learning how to communicate with somebody in a particular way that would ensure how that person is going to respond. Whereas the dismissing person is pretty confident that they're going to be rejected every single time because that was their early conditioning. A preoccupied adult never settles into a sense of safety and security in a relationship because they never know how to elicit from the other person their authentic needs to be met. And this comes from the experience of sometimes the caregiver responds appropriately, Sometimes they respond inappropriately and sometimes they don't respond. And so remember that in that secure dyadic experience, the child expresses something, the caregiver connects to it, empathetically understands it, mirrors back to the child so that they can see what that connection is, and then responds in a way that's useful to the child. But that doesn't happen for a preoccupied adult. The responses are all over the place, so they never learn what to do. So they're always in a question about, what do I do here to get the response that I want? And often they're obligated to respond in a way that the caregiver understands. There's no attempt by the caregiver to understand the needs of the child. The child has to learn the caregiver's responses. So the child moves out of being authentically responsive and attempting to respond in the way that they think in that moment the caregiver will understand what they want and provide that for them. Is that making sense? So they lose track of themselves and become oriented toward the caregiver. The view is external and other. Christian?
Can you contrast that that very external view of the preoccupied child, I guess, that is reading the caregiver and eliciting the response that way, with the dismissing or ambivalent child, avoidant child that is able to, I guess, transact and get the care from the caregiver? Is it because the caregiver is saying specifically, this is how I will take care of you if you do this, and then the child knows that and can do that consistently? Like, what's the difference between the two? Because they both get their needs, they both get something, they both get a response.
Right.
And so why does the avoidant child not get that, like, hyper attuned to the caregiver orientation?
Because of the consistency.
But what's actually, like, what is actually getting the care for the avoidant child?
The avoidant child learns what they have to do, what performance they have to give in order to get what they want. And each time they do that performance, they get what they want.
And that's because the caregiver is explicitly telling them what to do? Or
they learn it through observation and trial and error. But it's not inconsistent.
Okay.
They learn that if they authentically express some things to the caregiver, that's going to be rejected. And so they learn to keep those secret. They learn what the caregiver values and what the caregiver wants from them, and then they produce that. And then the caregiver responds in a consistent way.
Okay.
So what they get oriented toward is, what do I want and what do I have to then do to get it? And then they do the thing that they have to do to get it, and then they get it. Part of the thing that happens to dismissing people is that because it's an inauthentic expression, and because the expression for them is not often tied to something real, they learn that it's the expression itself that's enough. The transaction is complete when they make the expression. So one of the things that you'll notice in dismissing people is they promise to do everything for you. Everything that they think you need them to promise in order to get what they want from you, they'll promise. But in their mind, the expression of that is the complete. When you give them the thing that they want, the transaction is complete. Insecure people, you would expect them to deliver on the promises that they made. But a dismissing person doesn't have that association with making those promises. They think that the making of the promise is when you deliver to them what they want, that the transaction is complete. I'll love you forever. And then you give them what they want, And then that's it.
So it's that easy. You just have to say, I love you forever.
To somebody who would accept that, a secure person won't accept that. So when we talk about empathy, we talk about that first level of empathy, which is the visceral response, the witnessing of somebody's physical or emotional pain. And the second level of empathy is where you can look at somebody's facial expressions and body language and understand that that's a representation of that has some meaning to it, and you maybe can assign meaning to it. The third is that what we call in Buddhism compassion and empathy, where you actually feel in your body a facsimile of the emotional experience, the internal emotional experience of someone else. And then the fourth piece, which secure people require, is that you do what you say you're going to do. But in the experiences that they had in childhood, that always happened. And in insecure households, that doesn't happen so much. So dismissing person, the conundrum for a dismissing person is the parent says, "Oh, I love you. You're the most valuable person in the world to me," and then they're neglected. So how do you make sense of that contradiction? You make sense of it by splitting off what people say from what they do. So in the world of a dismissing person, what you say is what matters, not what you do. Your caregiver said to you that you are the most valuable child in the world, and the only way that you can sum that is by splitting off the fact that you're profoundly neglected. Is that making sense? And so you become self-oriented, you become internally oriented, because the only way that you can stand the experience of so much rejection and so much sadness is to disconnect from emotional experience. So the main way of regulating emotion that dismissing people use is to suppress awareness of it. And you can suppress it at a lot of different levels. You could suppress the felt sense of emotion and retain the capacity to recognize emotional states, another, which is a very effective place for dismissing people to be in. You can suppress the felt sense of emotion and also an understanding of body language and facial expressions, which is more limiting. If you're at that level, then you can only rely on what people tell you. So you have to get good at quizzing people to tell you in a way that's not obvious, so that you have that information that they use. And then you can even suppress the felt sense of pain in other people. Well, maybe we should talk about preoccupied people. Zoom user. You have to unmute.
Got it. Hi, everybody. George, thank you. Would you piece out a little bit of disorganized? Sort of, because as you describe, I'm like, yep, that's a little bit of me. That's a little bit of me. Like, I feel like a buffet of all of these things. But I know that historically I've, frozen, I guess, in relationship and pushed it away because it was too nerve-wracking, because showing, I believe that I wouldn't be able to show up regularly for someone. So yeah, I don't think I expressed it the way I would have liked to. But
So disorganization is where you have responses that are secure, dismissive, or preoccupied as a kind of complex system. Where the child has had to learn multiple strategies in order to respond. So that comes from an environment that was very complex. And so there was no reliable, excuse me, way of responding. How that manifests in terms of relationships is that it's very hard for somebody to predict how you're going to respond. And so they don't settle into a sense of safety with you, a sense of reliability with you, because they can't predict how they're going to respond. What we all want to do in relationships is to learn the way to communicate to the other person so that we can be effective in our communication to them. And if you can't predict how somebody is going to respond, you can't learn a vocabulary so that it puts you in an unreliable category. If you're in an unreliable category, then pretty much you're self-excluding from secure people because they won't do unreliable. And then you're going to have to be in relationship with people who don't mind whether you're reliable or not. And so the only people that really don't mind whether you're unreliable or not are dismissing people or other disorganized people. Dismissing people don't mind you being unreliable as long as when you show up, you have the juice that they want or the psychic supplies that they want. And disorganized
when
people
we
are...
talk about,
Go ahead.
When we talk about unreliable, so I clearly have a history of like flaking.
Right.
Could that be? But I don't think that like my emotional responses or what have you in relationships is unreliable.
So flakiness is another thing. So flakiness is about the experience of not being able to reliably regulate your own emotional states. So you can't predict what state you're going to be in, so that when you make a plan with somebody, if you're in an emotional state where you can't follow through on the plan, you don't. You make all sorts of explanations for that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether or not you have a good reason for not being able to come, or you're actually describing an emotional experience that you're having that prevents you from coming. At the end of the day, reliable people want you to show up. And so their expectation is that you have the capacity to emotionally regulate yourself well enough that you do show up. And that's what matters. And so the reason that disorganized people have a hard time emotionally regulating is because they are auto-regulators, and they would throw into themselves to regulate, which is a really inefficient way of doing it. If a secure person is dysregulated and they can't regulate themselves, they reach out to somebody who they have available to them will help them regulate, so that they never really go too long without being in contact with somebody who's effective in regulating them. Disorganized people don't do that. So they are often in a situation where they're dysregulated and they don't have anyone that they can rely on to help them regulate. And so the process of re-regulating takes much longer. There are also a fearfulness around what will happen if they make the wrong response. And so they get into these loops of where they have to come up with the exact right response so that they protect themselves from the catastrophic results that could happen from making the wrong response. But then they have the childhood experience where if they don't respond, they can have catastrophic responses from their caregivers, which is not something that more organized attachment strategies have. Is that making sense? So the dysregulation, the emotional dysregulation that they experience is something that they take on for themselves to regulate, and depending on the depth of the dysregulation, it can take quite a while, hours or days even, for them to re-regulate. And so they have a response time that's very unpredictable and way too long for somebody who's expecting a more secure response. Makes sense?
Which I relate. I don't too much. Yeah.
So then,
Yes, thank you.
part of this is the changing of the view that you're in danger now. You were in danger in childhood and had not so much control over it, but you don't have that now if you're careful about who you pick to be in relationship to. We didn't get too preoccupied, and we're about out of time for talking, so we can continue with this next time. But Randy or Debbie, your hand is up.
Oh.
I didn't know how to unmute. I hate this. George, I wanted to ask you a question about, like, I guess, I don't know how, if this is related to view and attachment particularly, but like there are times where, you know, I've had interactions with someone in my life where they have a very, you know, colored view of the world based on it's probably based on their attachment. And in particular, like they have, it's my sibling, and I think he and my mother are similar, where they will project a kind of like, you did not fulfill my expectations in a certain way, you ought to. And then there's like a view that's very strongly cast, and then it elicits like a guilt from people around that person. And I wonder if that's related to a specific attachment style, or how that, I don't know how to describe it, but like if somebody has a view and that also affects your response and your view of yourself in relationship to them, if that makes sense. Like their anger elicits a guilt kind of thing.
Right. So you express yourself in a way, and then they reflect that back to you. So you see yourself as they reflect it back to you. And in childhood, we have a tendency to take on the reflection as it being true. And what you're describing is the adult condition where you're getting this reflection back, but it doesn't seem to match well enough to who you think you are now. But it still has that programming to cause a sense of guilt arising in you, so that they're eliciting from you a response that you're conditioned to respond at so that they can get from you what they want. Is that making sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And that's related to, do you think that's related to attachment, or
I think that the inducing of guilt in somebody else is usually comes from a presentation of helplessness of some sort, which would point toward a preoccupied expression. I can't do this for myself, and you can do it for me, so you should do it for me, which is what creates the sense of guilt. What?
I'm angry at you if you don't do it for me.
Right, because I can't do it for myself, and you can. And so if you don't do it for me, then it won't be done for me.
Right. Uh, it's
But
so aggravating.
the part that's aggravating is that it's probably not true.
Right, it isn't true.
Right.
And like it then kind of like being in relationship with someone who is presenting that can be very frustrating, in a way that you're just like you want to be in relationship with them, but the guilt that they're trying to elicit, it can be so, it feels so aversive, like it feels like such negative emotion that it brings up,
Well,
and
it's
it
hard to be in relationship to them because it's so inauthentic. So
Yeah.
how do you have an authentic relationship with somebody who responds so consistently in an inauthentic manner? That's the main
How-
conundrum,
right.
I think.
Do you have
So what,
suggestions?
what I usually say is, um, what are you going to do? I can't do that for you, but what are you going to do? Or what have you done? Because a lot of times they've already made a decision about what they're going to do. Well, that's an interesting thought. What are you going to do about it? So you just don't take it on, but then ask them what they're going to do. Well, if you want to brainstorm, I'm happy to do that. And then after a little brainstorm, you can say, well, what'd you decide to do? Uh, they want you to solve the problem, but really it's not about solving the problem. It's about the proximity that they can get from engaging you in a problem solving experience. So that if you see it clearly and understand that it's not actually about solving the problem, it's about connecting, then you can move past you having any responsibility or needing to solve the problem to just how they're going to solve it. And that might be more useful for them. But it, secure relationships function on an authentic expression, and if they're unable to express themselves authentically, it's hard to have that. So then you're orienting them as a C or a D in the framework of the Dunbar framework.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Most of the time with preoccupied people, if they present a problem to you and you present a solution to them, they reject the solution because it's not about finding a solution. And so you end up in a helpless loop with them. They keep presenting the problem, you keep presenting solutions, and none of them work. Which ultimately what that ends up is you feeling a sense of helplessness, which is one of the things that we don't like in relationships. We don't like to feel that we're helpless to help somebody who's demanding that we help them. So that's one of the things that we become aversive to and withdraw from because of the unpleasantness of the experience. But I'm thinking maybe we should do some metta practice. So I'll let you choose who you want to practice for. But go ahead and take your meditation postures and we'll begin. How did that go? Good. We have a retreat coming up. There's still some spaces left in that. If you're interested, let us know. We're doing a level 1 for Central European time in November. I think that's what's coming up mainly for the rest of the year. Christian?
George, could I just ask you something briefly after the class?
Okay. I offer this teaching on a dana basis. Dana is the Pali word for generosity. There's a link on the website to make a donation. Any amount is appreciated. Help support me and also the work Mettagroup is doing. Of course, we do welcome you to come practice with us. I will be here next Thursday, but the Thursday after that, I'll be on retreat and then back after that. Good to see you. See you soon.